Welcome back to the Tarikamba podcast and videocast. I'm Solomon Kiprige. Today's episode, we will look at Emperor Yekuno Amlak and the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty. According to the tradition claimed by Ethiopia's imperial dynasty, from the fall of Denyajan, or Dilnaod, and the exile of his son, Mahabharudam, to Shaw, there followed 10 generations of Solomonic princes who set down their roots in Shaw and continued as claimants of the throne occupied by the Zagwe dynasty. Mahabharudam was followed by his son Agwazion, who was followed by Sinfa-Arad, followed by his son Nugusari, succeeded by his son Asfaha, followed by his son Yaqub, followed by his son Bahar-Sagged, succeeded by his son Adam Asked or Wudamasked. Wudamasked would be the father of Tesfa Jesus, also known as Yekuno Amlak. It would be Yekuno Amlak who would succeed in raising a successful rebellion and remove the last of the Zagwe emperors and mount the throne of his fathers. According to the chronologies of Ethiopian monarchs, Emperor Yekuno Amlak re-established the Solomonic dynasty on the imperial throne and restored the legitimate bloodline over the empire. He claimed uninterrupted male line descent from the last of the Aksumite emperors, Dilnaod, who was deposed by Yodit Gudit in the 10th century. Yekuno Amlak was born in the town of Sagart, not far from the modern city of Desi. His father had been appointed governor of either Ambasal or Ambagishan at the time. His name, Yekuno Amlak, means "May God be his protector" or his support. Most of Yekuno Amlak's history is recorded in oral traditions and a few accounts preserved in hagiographies, such as that of the island monastery of Stefanos on Lake Haik in modern-day Nwodlo zone of the Amhara region, where Yekuno Amlak was said to have been educated in his youth, and in the Gadls of two particular local saints, the Tekle Zena and the Tekle Goestos. Gadls are written works which glorify particular saints, speaking about their histories, their works, and their miracles. From these two Gadls, it would seem that just as crucial to the young prince's rise from claimant to crowned monarch as his illustrious paternal lineage from the Aksumite emperors were his extensive blood ties of his maternal family to influential and powerful clergymen of the Orthodox Church. These clerical relatives presented the growing power of the network of monastic communities in Tigray, the region that would later become Nwodlo, and through Shoa to the remote south. Yekuno Amlak's rise from a dispossessed claimant to the acknowledged emperor and king of kings of Ethiopia was facilitated by two powerful clergymen who would play key roles in the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty and who are venerated today as saints of the Orthodox Church. They are Abba Jesus Moa, which means Father Jesus Victorious, abbot of the Stefanos Monastery of Lake Haik, near the great mountain fortress of Ambasal, and the great Abba Tekle Haimanot, Father Plant of Faith, abbot and founder of the Monastery of Debre Libanos in the Shoan district of Salale, and probably the greatest of Ethiopia's native saints. One might wonder why these churchmen would champion Yekuno Amlak so strongly when the Zagwe emperors had been such devout patrons of the Orthodox Church. In the Tekle Goestos and the Tekle Zena there is to be found a compelling maternal lineage for Yekuno Amlak that may explain why the church, or rather prominent church fathers, came down so strongly in favor of his cause and against the devout Zagwes. Ties of blood and close kinship bound the leading churchmen of the day to the Shoan Solomonic claimant. The roots of this tight familial bond were two prominent figures of the late Zagwe period: Matthios, the Makonnen, or ruler, of Wagda and Katata, and the priest Zacharias, a powerful and widely respected clergyman. Matthios had a son, Medhanina Igzi, who became ruler of Fatagar, and daughters Menezion and Ubezion. Zacharias had 4 sons, Zaggazaab, Arkaladis, Theodros, and Indrias. Matthios of Wagda Katata and Zacharias the priest bound their families together with several marriages. Matthios' granddaughter by his son Medhanina Igzi of Fatagar was Igzi-Harea, and she married Zaggazaab, son of Zacharias the priest. Zaggazaab and Igzi-Harea were the parents of Abba Tekle Haimanot, who became the prominent saint and abbot. Matthios' daughter, Sion, married Zacharias the priest's son, Arkaladis, and their son was the great Abba Moa, another great abbot and influential clergyman. Matthios' other daughter, Sion, first married Galaudius, ruler of Doaro. They had 2 sons and a daughter. Their eldest son was Abba Goestos of Sarmat, another important abbot and future saint. Interestingly, Galaudius of Doaro abandoned his marriage and joined his eldest son as a monk. His and Sion's second son, Iyasu, became the ruler of Doaro in his father's place. The third child of Galaudius and Sion, a daughter whose name is lost to history, was the mother of another great monk, Abba Tesfahazen. Critically, abandoned by her first husband, Sion married again. This time, she married Abetu Wudamasked, the heir of the old Aksumite emperors. They had twins, one of whom was the future emperor Yekuno Amlak, and the other his twin sister, Deborah. Yekuno Amlak's sister, Deborah, would marry another son of Zacharias the priest, Theodros, and bore the great Abba Zena Marcos of Debre Libanos, another great abbot and saint. The remaining son of Zacharias the priest was Andreas, father of Abba Samuel of Debre Wegag, or Asabot Monastery. Yekuno Amlak was thus at the time of his ascendance, cousins and uncle of all the most powerful leaders of the Orthodox monastic communities in the empire and its various vassal states. The influence of these monastic leaders in the church was undoubtedly decisive in turning the hearts and minds of a country and indeed the state legitimacy from an established reigning house to the heir of a long-fallen dynasty. Legends state that several prophecies, one account even credits a rooster with voicing one of these prophecies, were made saying that the young son of the Shoan prince Abetu Wudamasked and his wife Sion, Abetu Yekuno Amlak, would succeed to the imperial throne of his Aksumite ancestors. As the tale of these prophecies spread, Yekuno Amlak's mother became fearful that the Zagwe emperors would try to eliminate this threat to their throne. So she traveled to Lake Haik, where the abbot of the monastery there, Abba Moa, agreed to give the little prince sanctuary. No doubt, Sion's extensive network of relatives in the influential church positions would have played a role in convincing Abba Moa to be receptive to giving sanctuary to her son. It was an Ethiopian tradition that boys and young men looking to achieve a certain level of education would do so in the great monasteries of the country. And so Yekuno Amlak spent the years of his sanctuary at Lake Haik being educated. Indeed, some traditions maintain that Yekuno Amlak reached the level of memher, or teacher, scholar, in the study of church liturgy and hymnology. Abba Moa was a man who enjoyed considerable influence at the Zagwe court, and the latter Zagwe emperors had been generous in their patronage of his new monastery on Lake Haik, to the point that it had emerged as the preeminent monastic house in the realm, eclipsing even the older Debre Damo and the other monasteries established by the 9 saints of the Aksumite era. Abba Moa was born on an uncertain date in a place called Dahana, which may have been the village of Dahana, just east of the Tekle River in Tigray, or may have been a place in Wegag, part of the Ago heartland of the Zagwe dynasty. When he was 30 years old, Moa entered the Debre Damo monastery and was invested as a monk by the great abbot Abba Johannes. He studied under Abba Johannes for 7 years, and the abbot tested his commitment to the monastic life by assigning him difficult tasks. He eventually left Debre Damo and went to the church of Stefanos, or St. Stephen, located on an island in Lake Haik. Today, that island has become a peninsula, but the church is still there. The original church had been built by the Aksumites in the 8th century. He found a group of hermits living on this island and organized them into a monastic community. Among the 10 original novice monks of Stefanos Monastery of Lake Haik was the young Abba Tekle Haimanot, Yekuno Amlak's first cousin once removed, and perhaps Ethiopia's greatest saint who spread the Orthodox faith well beyond the areas that it had existed in until then. Abba Tekle Haimanot would spend 10 years studying at Haik under Abba Moa before going off to Aksum, and from there to the great monastery of Debre Damo, where he also studied under the abbot Abba Johannes. Abba Tekle Haimanot, who by now had assembled a group of followers in his own right, decided to return to Shoa and establish his own monastery. On his return route southward, he stopped once more at St. Stephanos' monastery on the hike to be fully invested as a monk by Abba Yesusmoa. Upon his return to Shoa, Abba Tekle Haimanot established a new monastery at the edge of the towering escarpment between Salali and Graya districts and named it Debre Libanos in the year 1284. In the 15th century, it would be renamed Debre Libanos and would eclipse Haik and all other monasteries as the greatest monastic house in the realm. As mentioned earlier, Tekle Haimanot was born into a well-to-do clerical family, the great-nephew of Yekuno Amlak's mother Minezyon. He was born at Tisa in northern Shoa and would herald a renewal of the Christian faith in Shoa and also go on to spread the Christian faith far to the south of Shoa into the old regions of Damo and Bali and among the Sidama people. His disciples carried the faith even further afield. His cousin, Abba Samuel, established Debre Wegag or Asabot Monastery near what is now Harar, and Abba Zena Marcos, another cousin, established Debre Bisrat, and Abba Koestos and Abba Tesfahazen, to mention a few others, established other monasteries around the region. Abba Tekle Haimanot has traditionally been given the lion's share of the credit of restoring the Solomonic line of the old Aksumite Empire, and indeed some accounts make out that he was the sole actor in maneuvering the Zagwes off their throne. The saint is credited in his hagiography with many incredible spiritual feats, such as praying for 7 years on one leg while standing in a cave surrounded by spears so that he would not fall asleep. His leg is said to have withered and fallen off. He is also said to have been rewarded for his piety with the 6 wings of heavenly seraphim, and is shown in Ethiopian and Coptic iconography with 6 wings and standing on one leg. Tekle Haimanot and his monks at Debre Libanos, or Debre Libanos, and Tisa were part and parcel of the Shoan loyalists of the old Aksumite dynasty, which after 10 generations they regarded as their own, fortified with their ties of blood to the young heir through his mother. Although Abba Yesusmoa had strong ties to the devout Zagwe court, his close association with the Solomonic heir from Shoa, whom he'd practically raised in his monastery, would have weakened those bonds with the Zagwes. The ecclesiastic duo of Abba Tekle Haimanot and Abba Yesusmoa would play a vast role in the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty, and would seal the iron bonds that held the Ethiopian monarchy and the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church to each other. While the restored Solomonic dynasty was of a far more militaristic bent than the pious, virtually clerical Zagwe monarchs, the bonds that tied the church to the dynasty and the dynasty to the church would be firmly and deeply rooted. Traditionally, Saint Tekle Haimanot has been given the lion's share of the credit for restoring the Solomonic dynasty to the throne it had lost 2 centuries earlier. Many modern historians, such as G.W.B. Huntington and Carlo Conti Rossini, have indicated that Abba Yesusmoa may have actually played the larger role. However, the ties of blood between the other abbots led by Abba Tekle Haimanot to Yekuno Amlak cannot be underemphasized. Regardless of which saint is credited, accounts agree that the clergy were key in bringing the House of Solomon to the throne. Tekle's Adik Mokrea writes that Abba Tekle Haimanot had come back to Haik to visit his mentor Abba Yesusmoa when he met his cousin, the young Yekuno Amlak, at the monastery. Overjoyed at meeting the prince, he expressed his fears to Abba Yesusmoa about the proximity of Haik to the Zagwe court at Lalibela. He suggested that he take the boy to Shoa for his safety. Yekuno Amlak was based largely in the region of Tekle, but Tekle Haimanot took him to other districts of Shoa, such as Marabiti, Yifat, Menz, and introduced him to the local nobility. Tekle's Adik Mokrea also quotes the Gedle Tekle Haimanot and writes that Yekuno Amlak also traveled to Lasta and served within the Zagwe palace under an assumed name in order to learn the practices and rituals of the imperial court. He states that as Abuna Tekle Haimanot traveled around the land preaching the gospel to the faithful and spreading it among the non-Christian populations, he also would preach that the Zagwes had illegitimately usurped the throne and that Yekuno Amlak was the rightful emperor. He even states that Abba Tekle Haimanot even preached this message in Lasta before Emperor Nakuto La'ab himself. Nakuto La'ab was a very devout man who, like many others, was deeply in awe of the saintly Tekle Haimanot. This is a man who is said to have worn a crown of thorns every Friday in place of his imperial crown, in memory of the crucified Christ. Indeed, Nakutola'ab would be made a saint himself eventually. However, the Gedla Tekle Haimanot states that Emperor Nakutola'ab agreed that upon his death it would be Yekuno Amlak who would succeed him, although Tekle's Adik Mokria and other historians find this to be unlikely. However, if this is not a later addition to further cement the succession of Yekuno Amlak, it would appear that Nakutola'ab's son took exception to this decision. Upon the emperor's death, Yekuno Amlak was seized and imprisoned on Mount Malot by the new Zagwe emperor Za'ilmaknun, son of Emperor Nakutola'ab and great-nephew of Emperor Lalibela. His name, Za'ilmaknun, which means the unknown, is an unusual one, and may be that his actual name was later blotted from the chronicles and replaced with the unknown, either by his Zagwe rivals such as Emperor Itbarek or by the Solomonic dynasty that followed. Yekuno Amlak managed to escape from detention, however, and fled back to Shoa. He assembled an army to challenge the Zagwe monarchy and marched back north. In the meantime, Za'ilmaknun himself had lost his throne to his cousin, Emperor Yitbarek, a son of Emperor Lalibela. It was Yitbarek who raised his banner and met the Solomonic claimant in battle to defend the Zagwe dynasty. However, the Zagwes found that they were at a distinct disadvantage. First, they were divided amongst themselves, with Yitbarek only recently displacing his cousin on the throne. Inter-Zagwe rivalries continued to simmer. Secondly, Yekuno Amlak, with his claims of descent from the Aksumite emperors, had captured the popular imagination, with images of past glories and greatness inspiring nobles and commoners to flock to his banner. Most critically, the leadership of the Orthodox Church, the network of monasteries led by powerful and popular clergymen, most related to the new claimant, had lined up solidly behind Yekuno Amlak. This endorsement gave the Shoan prince a legitimacy beyond military conquest that the Zagwes could not compete with. The Zagwes, never a great military house, were defeated at the Battle of Ansita in July 1270, where Yitbarek was confronted by Yekuno Amlak and his allies, which included the Gafat people, commanded by an unnamed Muslim simply called the Malasai. The Gafat people were an ethnic group that once inhabited present western Ethiopia. They spoke the Gafat language, an extinct South Ethiopic grouping within the Semitic subfamily of the Afroasiatic languages, and closely related to Harari and Eastern Guragi languages. It was more distantly related to Amharic, Tigrinya, and Ge'ez. It is believed that the Gafat have largely assimilated into the Amhara ethnic group. Also fighting on Yekuno Amlak's side was the Sultan Dil Gamis and his army from the Muslim Sultanate of Shoa. The Shoa Sultanate, distinct from the largely Christian Shoa province to its west, was a Muslim kingdom in present-day Central East Ethiopia. Its capital, Walali, was situated in northern Hararge in Harla County. Its territory extended, possibly to some areas west of the Awash River. The rise of the Sultanate of Shoa had played a role in the decline of the Aksumite Empire. Several engravings dating back to the 13th century showing the presence of the Sultanate can be found in Jalango, Bati, Harla near Deradawa, and Munesa near Lake Langano. It was one of the oldest documented Muslim states in the region. The Sultanate occupied a stretch of inland Muslim trade lines and dominions known to the Arab world as the country of Zela, as these routes fed into the trading port of Zela on the northern coast of what is now known as Somaliland. The Sultanate of Shoa was ruled by a dynasty known as the Makhzumis, who were believed to have been Arab immigrants who arrived in Shoa during the 7th century. This ruling family reigned there from approximately 896 to 1286, a period of 390 years. The Makhzumi dynasty was eventually deposed by the Walasma dynasty of Yifat, who would reign over the Yifat and later Adal sultanates from 1285 until 1415. Both the Makhzumis and the Gafat people had long paid tribute to the Zagwes as their feudal overlords. These various sultans and kings owed allegiance to the King of Kings of Ethiopia. This alliance with Yekuno Amlak may have been inspired to lessen this load of tribute and taxes under a friendlier emperor. What followed the Battle of Ansita, which took place in the district of Gaint, north of the Bashilo River, is something of a mystery. The dominant account is that following his defeat, the Emperor Yitbarek was convinced to abdicate the throne in favor of the victorious Yekuno Amlak by Abba Tekle Haimanot. Other accounts state that Yitbarek was murdered by rival Zagwes, and that another Zagwe emperor, whose name was later purged from the history rolls, tried to rally his dynastic allies but was defeated and driven out as well. Some accounts name this Zagwe emperor as Harbe II. Another account states that Yekuno Amlak's men were tipped off by loyalists of the rival Zagwe branch and pursued Yitbarek into the church of Saint Cyriacus, or Kirkos, near Ansita, and slew him there, on the Feast of the Holy Trinity, July 14th, 1270. There are those who give the credit of finally convincing the Zagwes to abandon further resistance and step down to Abba Jesus Moa, but regardless of which version we prefer to accept, the result was the same. The Zagwe dynasty gave way to the House of Solomon with the active participation of the Orthodox Church in the transition. The settlement that was reached with the new emperor, Yekuno Amlak, was that the imperial throne was henceforth settled on the Solomonic descendants of Yekuno Amlak, the rightful hereditary heir of the old Aksumite emperors, descended in an unbroken line from Menelik I, son of Makeda, queen of Sheba, and King Solomon of ancient Israel. The title and dignity of Siyuma Gziavir, elect of God, would be borne by the emperor of the Solomonic dynasty, and he would be the king of kings of Ethiopia. The house of Zagwe would owe fealty to the house of Solomon in perpetuity and recognize its legitimacy. The Zagwes did not walk away empty-handed. In exchange for their fealty, the Solomonic dynasty granted the Zagwes the districts of Lasta and Wag as their fief in perpetuity. The head of their house would bear the title of Wagshum, or Wagsiyum, Lord of Wag, one of the few strictly hereditary titles in Ethiopia. The Wagshum would be second in dignity to the emperor and his family. He would be entitled to be seated in the presence of the monarch if the emperor was also seated. He would have the right to a silver throne to be placed one step below the emperor's golden throne. He would have the right to have the Nagarit war drum beaten for him in the same manner as the emperor as well. He had the right to be preceded by 2 silver Nagarit drums mounted on horses during wartime or mules in peacetime, in processions where he was present. The guards of the Wagshum would have their spears ornamented with silver wire, and the staff of his banner could be tipped in silver. When the emperor and the Wagshum met, they would greet each other like brothers by kissing each other on both cheeks, and the Wagshum was not to bow to the ground before the emperor as all others were expected to do. The Wagshum was exempted from tributes and taxes expected of other vassals of the emperor. This arrangement remained intact for over 7 centuries, from 1270 until the fall of the Ethiopian monarchy in 1974. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church received the biggest reward from the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty. The book Be'ele Negest details the covenant entered into between the new emperor and the church. What it says is, Wudim Saged bore a son named Yekuno Amlak, and Abuna Tekle Haimanot restored the kingdom to him from the Zagwes. At this time, Abuna Tekle Haimanot was 55 years old, so Yekuno Amlak gave him Siso, or 1/3 of the kingdom, and entered into a covenant with him, and the age from this time on became known as the Age of the Covenant. Georgis Walda Amid similarly states that 1/3 of the kingdom was handed to the church, but credit for the restoration is more broadly attributed to Abba Tekle Haimanot and Abba Jesus Moa, and to Abuna Erlos, the Coptic bishop, who was long dead by then, but who may well have endorsed a Solomonic restoration and assured that the Coptic patriarch did the same before his death. This land grant of 1/3 of the empire was known as Siso, or the 1/3. It was permanently exempt from state taxation. Only the church could tax revenue on these lands, and this remained in force until the fall of the Solomonic dynasty in 1974. This provided considerable income and power to the church and freed it from the largesse of the monarchy, the nobility, and other faithful, although all continued to give to it generously. Also, as part of this covenant, the abbots of the Monastery of Debre later renamed Debre Libanos, in succession to Saint Tekle Haimanot, were given the title of Ichegi, and the abbots of Haik, Stephanos, in succession to Saint Jesus Moa, were given the title of Agabi Sa'at. The title of Wegag remains associated with Debre Libanos. The Wegag became the senior-most and chief of all monks of the empire and was second only to the Coptic bishops or archbishops in precedence. As the bishops and archbishops were generally Copts who didn't speak the local languages, the Wegag as the senior-most native clergyman became the administrative head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Eventually, when Ethiopia received her first native archbishop, the office of Wegag was subsumed into it, as it was the Wegag who was elevated to this position in 1948. Eventually, the first archbishop, Abba was further elevated as the first patriarch of Ethiopia in 1959. Today, the title of Wegag of the See of St. Tekle Haimanot remains one of the titles of the patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The title of Agabi Sa'at translates to Keeper of the Hours, and eventually became disassociated with the Monastery. While it was always held by a high clergyman, it became a title of the emperor's court rather than a church title. The Agabi Sa'at held a silver staff of office and presided over the imperial court both as a sort of master of ceremonies as well as the keeper of the emperor's schedule. This position wielded immense power for centuries, but became largely ceremonial when the emperors lost all power in the Zemene Mesafint and eventually went out of existence. Yekuno Amlak was crowned and took the additional throne name of Tesfa Jesus. He established a seat in Shoa at Tekle and an additional seat near what is now Ankober. This brought the political center of the empire to the furthest south it had ever been at that point, having migrated in the southern direction from Aksum to Lasta and now to northern Shoa. There is written evidence that the emperor was widely referred to by the short name of Yukunut. Emperor Yekuno Amlak is said to have campaigned against the kingdom of Damo, which lay south of the Abba River, to re-establish hegemony with the change of the imperial dynasty. According to Arabic texts found in Harar, deposed Sultan Dilmara of the Sultanate of Shoa successfully appealed to Yekuno Amlak in 1279 to restore his rule over the Sultanate. So it appears that Yekuno Amlak moved decisively to re-establish imperial authority over Ethiopia's subsidiary monarchies in the aftermath of the change of dynasty from the Zagwes to the House of Solomon. E. A. Wallace Budge states that Yekuno Amlak not only exchanged letters with the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, but also sent him several giraffes as gifts. At first, his interactions with his Muslim neighbors were friendly. However, his unsuccessful attempts to obtain a bishop for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church from the Coptic Patriarchate in Alexandria strained these relations. The previous bishop, Abba had died, and a replacement proved difficult to obtain. A letter survives that Yekuno Amlak wrote to the Mamluk Sultan Baibars, who had control over the Patriarchate of Alexandria, for his help in obtaining a new bishop in 1273. The letter suggests that this was not his first request. When a new bishop did not arrive, Yekuno Amlak blamed the intervention of the Sultan of Yemen, who had hindered the progress of his messengers to Cairo. More likely, the Mamluk Sultan Baibars was probably annoyed at Yekuno Amlak's involvement in the succession dispute in the Shoa Sultanate and in the emergent Adal Sultanate, and decided to withhold approval of the Coptic Patriarch sending a bishop. The absence of a bishop was a serious problem for a Christian monarchy. Only a bishop or an archbishop could consecrate a church, ordain priests and deacons, or crown an emperor. Without ordained priests, weddings, christenings, and funerals could not be held, which would be a huge burden on the people and the state. The longer the country went without a bishop, the bigger the problem became. Later, Yekuno Amlak is said to have sent lavish gifts to the Egyptian sultan, but that the rebellious governor of Sahart in modern Tigray seized these gifts, which included rare lions said to be as black as night. Professor Taddese Tamrat interprets Yekuno Amlak's son's allusions to Syrian priests at the royal court as a result of this lack of attention from the patriarch. He also notes that around this time, the Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria, Pope Johannes VII, and the Syriac Patriarch of Antioch were struggling for control of the appointment of the bishops of Jerusalem, until then the prerogative of the Patriarchs of Antioch. According to Tekle's Adik Mokria, One of the moves in this dispute was the Syriac Patriarch Ignatius IV Yeshu appointing a Syrian monk as Bishop of Ethiopia. Although the Patriarchs of the Holy See of St. Mark of Alexandria had always appointed Ethiopia's bishops, the fact that Ethiopia's first bishop, Abuna Salama Kasati Burhan, had been a Syrian gave the Syriac Patriarch an opening to appoint one of his compatriots to the Diocese of Ethiopia. This bishop took the name and title of Abuna Iyub, or Job. This enraged the Patriarchate of Alexandria, which had maintained that it had the sole right to appoint bishops for Ethiopia, and that they had to be Copts. The Syriacs had worked closely with the Roman Catholic Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, so the new Syriac-appointed bishop Abuna Iyub traveled to Ethiopia accompanied by Catholic Dominican monks. These Dominicans never reached the emperor in Shoa, but set up base in Tigray and began preaching and conducting church services. However, it soon became apparent to the local people and clergy that these Dominicans did not reject the Council of Chalcedon as the Ethiopian Coptic and Syriac churches did, and upheld the doctrine that Christ had two natures and not one. This doctrine of two natures was considered highly heretical in Ethiopia and was rejected and anathematized. An uproar ensued, and the Dominicans were expelled as heretics. This, however, deeply undermined the Syrian Abuna Iyub, who was now regarded with suspicion for having brought these heretics with him. Taddessa Tamurat argues that the lack of Coptic bishops forced Yekuno Amlak to rely on these Syrian partisans who arrived in his kingdom, but it was not a popular move among the people or the clergy. As a result, Abuna Iyub never proceeded to Shoa and was never received by Yekuno Amlak. So in another stopgap solution, the senior clergy assembled and elected Abba Tekle Haimanot to the office of the bishop temporarily as a sort of locum tenens, or acting bishop. He eventually relinquished that role when a bishop finally arrived in the next reign, but this further established a tradition that the abbot of Debre Libanos' monastery, titled as the Zagwe, being the highest-ranking native cleric of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Yekuno Amlak is credited with the construction of the Church of Ganneta Mariam near Lalibela, which contains the earliest surviving datable wall paintings in Ethiopia. Al-Makriz relates that a clan known as the Kurazit or Banu, descendants of Abu Talib, had migrated from Hijaz in the Arabian Peninsula to the district of Gabat between Zela and Yifat, where they settled and became widely respected in the region. Emperor Yekuno Amlak appointed one of them, named Umar Walasma, to govern the area. Umar Walasma established the Muslim Walasma dynasty, which would rule the Yifat Sultanate and eventually the Great Adal Sultanate that served both as vassal and as challenger to the Solomonic dynasty and Ethiopia over the following centuries. In the later years of his reign, Yekuno Amlak enthroned his son Yegba as co-monarch. There's a record of a gift of vestments and holy vessels to the Haik Monastery given in the name of both emperors. Emperor Yekuno Amlak died on June 19, 1285. He was initially buried in a place called Yekuno, but his descendant Emperor Ba'eda Mariam I had his remains reinterred in the Church of Atron Samariam 2 centuries later. This is Solomon Kibrigi, thanking you for joining until the next episode of Tarikamba.